In the 4th year of my marriage to Paul, his unforgettable first love returned to the country after her divorce. To make things worse, I was diagnosed with cancer and was nearing the end of my life. During the less than 6 months I had left, I continued to play the role of Paul's good wife, all the way until my death. And Paul, after reading the diary I left behind, completely broke down. Chapter 1. Holding that thin diagnosis sheet, I stood at the hospital entrance, thinking about calling Paul. I opened the contact list, but after hovering over his name, I backed out. His call came first. His voice, as usual, was deep and cold, but softened a bit when he called my name. Elena. I have something to do tonight. Won't be back for dinner. I might come home late. So go to bed early. The words I wanted to say got stuck in my throat. All right. As usual. It was brief. The busy tone followed, but I kept the phone to my ear. The setting sun on the horizon was as red as blood. Chapter 2. Paul and I have been married for 4 years, and I've liked him for almost 10 years. I was lucky. Paul, pressured by his family, was going on blind dates all the time. I happened to meet him, and since I met his standards, we agreed to get married. Paul needed a wife, and I was just the right fit. He's a cold person, not talkative, doesn't show emotions, and rarely has any expressions. I warmed this block of ice for 2 years, and finally, he melted for me. We started to resemble a normal couple, living through the daily grind, gradually becoming the couple I had always dreamed of. But now, this beautiful dream, which hadn't lasted long, was about to be shattered. Because today, the doctor told me I have pancreatic cancer. I also knew that today was the day his unforgettable first love, Selena, returned. So he hurriedly ended my call to see the one who has always been on his mind. Chapter 3. I didn't eat and waited for him in the living room for a long time. I waited until the night deepened, and when the living room door opened, I was startled awake from my drowsiness. Paul carefully closed the door, his footsteps light. The moment the living room light came on, our eyes met. He paused for only a moment, then frowned slightly. Why aren't you asleep yet? I accidentally fell asleep in the living room. I smiled at him. I woke up as soon as I heard the sound. Paul simply responded with an his expression calm. I stepped forward to take his coat, and the scent of sandalwood mixed with gardenia wafted into my nose, making me nauseous. It was Selena's favorite floral fragrance. On the day I was diagnosed with a terminal illness, my husband drove to pick up his unforgettable first love who had returned to the country. Chapter 4. I should have asked him about it, but I just opened my mouth and said nothing, as if nothing had happened. The next day, I still got up early, just like usual, to make breakfast for Paul. Paul has stomach issues. When it was serious, he had to stay in the hospital for half a month, and I stayed with him the entire time. The doctors and nurses at the hospital all said he had found a good wife. Paul sat on the hospital bed, looking tired, and his gaze on me was indifferent. When it was just the two of us left in the ward, he spoke again. Hiring a caregiver would be just the same. I paused while peeling fruit. The once unbroken peel snapped, and he seemed to notice, adding, "You don't have to work so hard. It's different." But in reality, it's not that different. People always think that doing things personally is better than leaving them to others. When it comes to someone you care about, you naturally put in more effort than others would. What's different? I looked at him with a smile and gave an unrelated answer out of nowhere. You're my husband. His stomach problems never fully healed, so after he was discharged, I always tried to make sure he ate well. Paul is a workaholic. He often gets so busy that he forgets to eat. I would get up in the morning to make him breakfast, and when I had time, I would take lunch to his office. When I was busy, I would remind him to eat during meal times. In the blink of an eye, 2 or 3 years had passed, and many things became habits, like getting up early. Today, Paul got up earlier than usual. I didn't have time to straighten his tie before I saw him grabbing the lunchbox from the table and rushing out. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at me standing in the living room. A touch of warmth appeared on his usually expressionless face, like the first snow melting. I'm heading out. Elena, be careful on the road. Just like countless mornings before, It was a spur-of-the-moment decision to bring Paul lunch at noon. I didn't tell Paul. The receptionist at his company recognized me and let me up after a quick greeting. I had visited Paul's office many times. He would openly introduce me to everyone, saying, "This is my wife." The title carried a hint of old-fashioned charm, making one think of unwavering devotion from the past. For a while, I almost believed that we could go on like this forever. But life always loves to play tricks. First, it gives you a beautiful dream, and then it shatters it. It makes you see its true, hideous face amidst the wreckage. Like now, I saw my husband talking with his long-lost, unforgettable first love. In her hand was the lunchbox I had packed for Paul's breakfast. Selena seemed unchanged, still looking like she did in college, with long hair draped over her shoulders and a smile as innocent and sly as a cat's. "Thank you, Mr. Song." The breakfast was delicious. "No problem." Paul took the lunchbox. Selena was about to say something else when she suddenly noticed me standing not far away. Her expression turned to surprise, her eyes curving into crescents. "Elena, long time no see." She walked quickly towards me, reaching out to grab my hand, but stopped when she saw the lunchbox in my hand. "Did you bring Paul lunch? So you're the one who made his breakfast this morning?" "Sorry. I was feeling a bit lightheaded, so Paul let me have it. If I'd known it was you who made it for Paul, I wouldn't have eaten it." Selena smiled at me apologetically, but I still want to say, "Elena, you're an excellent cook." "Of course, I am." Paul has a weak stomach and is very picky. I honed my cooking skills little by little for him. He knows that. I smiled back at her, but hid my hand behind my back, my nails digging into my flesh. At that moment, besides the anger, I suddenly felt a deep sense of resentment. A plan for revenge began to form in my mind, slowly becoming clearer. Chapter 5. Paul would never cheat. Even though Selena's presence still terrified me, I tried hard to play the role of a dutiful wife. The shackles of morality and responsibility would weigh on Paul. I didn't know who would break first, him or me. When he came home that evening, he brought me a gift. A pink diamond sparkled brilliantly under the light, and the exquisite design was clearly expensive. It was beautiful, but I didn't like it. I rarely wear jewelry, only dressing up for formal events when accompanying Paul to banquets. Paul isn't good with words, so I knew this gift was his way of apologizing and making up for what happened this morning. I still accepted it with a smile. Paul's expression softened slightly. I wasn't sure if it was because I didn't hold a grudge or because I wasn't angry with Selena. I casually placed the box in a drawer and went to bed before him. But I couldn't fall asleep. When he finally came to bed and lay down beside me, the familiar scent of sandalwood filled the air, and he carefully held me from behind. His warmth seeped through the thin fabric, and I closed my eyes, breathing evenly. Even after the man behind me fell asleep, I remained wide awake. The discomfort in my upper abdomen grew worse. I opened my eyes. Moonlight poured through the window, casting a silvery glow on the floor. I stared at it for a long time, until the world seemed so silent that it felt like I was the only one left. Only then did it finally sink in. I was dying. Chapter 6. As I sent Paul off in the morning, a notification popped up on my phone's calendar. I glanced at it quickly and remembered that today was the day to visit my mother. My parents divorced when I was very young. He didn't love my mom and had been secretly seeing someone else. The daughter they had together is even older than me. My mom raised me on her own, working hard to support us. So I vowed to study well, but I was unlucky and became the target of bullying by a small group, even though I did nothing wrong. Maybe it was just my shabby clothes that they didn't like. Or perhaps it was something I said one day that made them hold a grudge. I didn't dare tell my mom, and the teachers couldn't control them. The more I resisted, the more relentless they became. On the day I was surrounded by so many people, I had a moment of recklessness. The rough feel of the brick in my bag offered me some comfort. The leader of the group cast a contemptuous glance at me, about to deliver her judgment, and then Paul appeared. He was smart and knew that this wouldn't be a one-time thing. He made a conscious effort to protect me, shielding me from their repeated attacks, and I made it through those 3 years of middle school in peace. That's why I followed him so resolutely, got into the same university as him, and became a better person. But I was one step too late. Just as Paul was my light, he had also met his light, Selena. She's also my half-sister. Chapter 7. I brought a few things for my mom now that she has a new family. I only stayed for about 10 minutes, chatted with her briefly, and politely said goodbye. On the way back, as I approached the entrance of the neighborhood, I saw them again from a distance. Selena and Paul were walking side by side, talking about something. I saw a rare smile on my usually cold husband's face, a soft expression in his eyes. I froze in place. As they were talking and laughing, a dirty little dog suddenly jumped out from behind the bushes, barking twice at Selena. The two of them stopped, and Selena tried to pet it, but the dog growled and lunged at her leg, scaring her into Paul's arms. Paul caught her, his hand briefly resting on her waist before quickly letting go. When he turned his head, he saw me standing there, but Selena reacted faster than he did. Elena. I walked over numbly. Selena was about to say something, but I bent down first and picked up the dirty dog from the ground. The little dog seemed to be scared too, burrowing into my arms but not struggling. Paul. I smiled at him. I'm going to keep it. The atmosphere suddenly grew cold. I just kept smiling and repeated, I'm going to keep it. Chapter 8. Paul accompanied me to the vet to have the dog examined, and we found out it had many issues. Its bones were fractured, there were scratches on its abdomen, and countless other minor problems, but it was very well behaved, staying quiet and still while the vet examined it. Paul looked at me, wanting to say something but holding back. Even after we finished at the vet and headed home, he said nothing. The dog stayed at the clinic, and I named it Eve. When we got home, the tension between us was palpable. Paul didn't speak, and I remained silent too. It wasn't until we both entered the bedroom that the warm orange light made the room feel cozy. I sat on the bed, watching as Paul came in wearing his pajamas. The warm light softened his sharp features a bit. He rarely shows his emotions, even when he smiles. It's just a slight curve of his lips, like a fleeting moment that quickly disappears. I didn't know how much Paul cared for me, but I thought he must have felt something over the years. But those thoughts seemed ridiculous the moment Selena returned. Paul. I suddenly called out to him. He looked up at me, his expression both innocent and cold. Do your words still count? What words? You said, I'm your wife. You said you'd treat me well for the rest of your life. I smiled at him. Paul suddenly averted his eyes, his voice indifferent. Why are you asking this out of the blue? It's nothing. It just crossed my mind. The dull pain in my upper abdomen returned, the ache in my waist worsening at night, and my nerves throbbed like a tightly wound string. They do. As he answered, the room's light went out. His warm breath fell on my cheek as he lightly kissed me. Good night, Elena. As the person behind me gradually fell asleep, I carefully slipped out of his embrace, turning over to face him. Then, by the light of the moon, I traced the contours of his face inch by inch, from his brow to his chin. Paul wouldn't cheat, but he would always think of Selena. I suddenly wondered, when Paul looks back on this moment after I'm gone, how will he feel? Chapter 9. The day I left the hospital, I thought about so many things, but in the end, they all tangled together into a messy ball of yarn in my mind. The first thought that surfaced was, what would Paul do after I die? He would have to remarry. At that time, I thought, Selena is divorced, and if he's a widower, the two of them could end up together, and that would be okay. But not now. So, I changed my mind. The first time I met Selena was on my 10th birthday. My mom had managed to take a day off to take me out to eat. The restaurant was very upscale, and the dishes were quite expensive, so my mom only ordered a few. Not far from us sat a family of 3, laughing and chatting, while my mom and I remained mostly silent. The girl at that table kept laughing, wearing a beautiful princess dress and a glowing crown. Her dad was sitting across from her, constantly taking pictures of her. It wasn't until her dad got up to go to the bathroom that I recognized his familiar profile, and the fork in my hand dropped onto the table. My mom noticed my reaction, followed my gaze, and then looked back at me with a calm expression. Do you want to go say hello? She asked me calmly. After all, he is your father. When my father returned to his seat, the little girl ran to meet him. And he picked her up, lifting her high as they both smiled brightly. I shook my head. The image of my father in my memory was blurry because he was never close to me. On the rare occasions when I wanted to be affectionate with him, he would coldly reprimand me. The fractured image of my father confused me for a long time. Later, I realized that he just didn't love me. All those things that seemed out of reach to me were readily available to Selena. Chapter 10. I continued to act like nothing was wrong, treating Paul well, and occasionally catching the scent of gardenia on his clothes. Sometimes I'd see Selena's social media posts, with glimpses of Paul in the background. Subtle, but obvious. I'd linger on each post for a long time before giving her a like. But I never said anything. Just like before, I maintained the peaceful facade. Yet there was a vague sense of an impending storm. Unlike before, though, I quit my job, brought Eve into our home, and started keeping a diary again. I wrote in it daily, recording the monotonous routines and my physical condition. I began having sleepless nights, with a constant dull pain in my abdomen. I still cooked for Paul every day, but when it was time to eat, I would just stare at the food on the table, with no desire to eat. When I visited my mom again, we only chatted briefly. As usual, before I left, when she wasn't looking, I slipped a bank card with the password into a book on the table. It contained most of my savings. This would be the last time I visited her. She walked me to the door, her eyes lingering on my face as she added, "Take care of yourself." "Thank you. You too." My mom would be fine. She didn't love my dad, and she didn't love me, but she still took on the responsibility of being a mother and raised me to adulthood in good health. In the end, it seemed like karma. My dad went bankrupt, but my mom's luck turned. She married the man she loved, had my little brother, and they lived in harmony. Chapter 11. Paul came home early that evening, just as I finished making dinner. The dishes were steaming on the table. It had been a long time since we had dinner together like this. Since Selena came back, Paul had been getting busier and busier. Paul had good manners. He didn't speak while eating. In the past, I thought it was nice just to sit together like this, even in silence. Paul ate slowly, taking his time with each bite. I only ate a little before losing my appetite as the dull pain in my abdomen returned. Just then, Eve came downstairs and crawled under the dining table. I put down my chopsticks, and Paul glanced at me. I explained, "I'm going to get Eve some dog food." Eve's room was on the second floor, a storage room I had cleaned out and turned into her space. Her bowl was empty, so I refilled it, and Eve happily ate, wagging her tail. Watching her made me feel a bit better. But then the pain in my abdomen intensified, and a metallic taste rose in my throat. I covered my mouth with my hand, and when I pulled it away, the sight of bright red blood stung my eyes. Eve suddenly stopped eating, turned around, and started barking at me. I grabbed a tissue to wipe the blood away, then crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. I knelt down and patted her head, saying softly, "I'm okay." She barked twice more and then jumped onto my lap, nuzzling against me. Just then, someone knocked on the doorframe. Paul was standing in the doorway, watching us. "Let's finish dinner, Elena," he said gently. I had no appetite, but I forced myself to finish eating, and Paul went to the kitchen to wash the dishes. When he came out and saw me playing with Eve on the sofa, he sat down beside me. "Elena, I've been busy lately, but when things calm down, how about we go to the island? Would you like that?" I stroked Eve's ears and replied, "Sure." Going to an island with Paul had always been on my wish list. We were so distant before. After we got married, we didn't even go on a honeymoon. We just went on with our usual lives, going to work and coming home. When our relationship improved, I started hoping we could go to an island together, like a belated honeymoon. I never told Paul about this little wish. I just mentioned going on a trip a few times, but he was such a workaholic that the plan kept getting pushed back. Now, it was him who brought it up. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him looking at me, his almond-shaped eyes slightly curved. I pretended not to notice. He spoke again. "There's a banquet next Wednesday. Are you free to come with me?" I hesitated for a moment, then quickly regained my composure. "I won't go." Paul didn't press the issue, just nodded. My gaze remained on Eve. ignoring Paul completely. With Selena just back in the country, she was still building her network, and she wouldn't miss such a good opportunity. If she asked Paul to take her, he wouldn't refuse. Eve whined softly on my lap, and I petted her head. But Paul probably wouldn't expect that I would show up at that banquet, even if he planned to take Selena instead of me. Chapter 12. I still came. The banquet was dazzling, with men in suits and women in glamorous dresses moving around the hall, glasses clinking as everyone enjoyed themselves. And there I was, standing on the edge, out of place, like an intruder. Paul was easy to find. I had spent years following him, countless times searching for his figure in a crowd. He was wearing a well-tailored suit, standing tall and striking. The woman holding his arm was dressed in a red gown, vibrant like a rose. It was Selena. I watched them navigate the world of fame and fortune, laughing and chatting. They looked like a perfect match. Even though I had expected the scene, seeing it with my own eyes still felt like a slap in the face. My heart pounded violently, anxiety coiling around it like vines, tightening until it felt like it would burst. The tangled thoughts in my mind unraveled into chaos, my temples throbbing with each beat. But I did nothing, just stood there, watching them walk hand in hand, smiling and greeting everyone. I saw someone approach Paul, patting him on the shoulder and pointing in my direction. Paul turned to look at me. I wasn't wearing a beautiful dress, and I had lost a lot of weight. I hadn't dared to look in a mirror for a long time, afraid to see the prominent cheekbones and the skeletal face I had become. I knew he saw me, because his expression changed instantly, becoming grim. Through the bustling crowd, we locked eyes from afar. I simply looked at him, neither smiling nor crying. Seeing his expression change, seeing him pull his hand away from Selena's and start making his way towards me, struggling through the crowd, but I suddenly smiled at him, then turned and left. Chapter 13. When I got home, I headed straight for my old room. The tangled thoughts in my mind were tightly knotted, impossible to unravel. The vines around my heart only tightened further, as if they would explode at any moment. I finally lost my composure. I swept everything off the desk, the crash echoing loudly in the room. It wasn't enough. I ripped the books off the shelves, tearing them apart as paper scattered to the floor like an untimely snowfall. It wasn't enough. The small ornaments, the makeup, the skincare products, the delicate souvenirs Paul brought me from his trips, and the blocks we had built together. The urge to destroy and the violent impulses intertwined, parading in my mind. The room was a chaotic mess, reflecting the shattered state of my life. When I came back to my senses, the scissors were already pressed against my arm, and Eve was barking frantically at my feet. The dog's barking was sharp and urgent, but when I looked down at her, she suddenly quieted, opening her mouth in a silly grin. The scissors slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor, and Eve immediately jumped onto my lap, barking as she climbed. I numbly scooped her up, and she rubbed her furry head against me, her small body warm. I held her, and suddenly, I started to cry. All the impulses faded away, leaving behind nothing but a deep, bottomless void in my heart. Such torment. Chapter 14. By the time Paul came home, I had already cleaned up the room. He wanted to talk to me, but I just sat on the sofa, smiling at him. I knew he wanted to explain, but he didn't know how to begin. I had been with him for 4 years, navigating the world of fame and fortune with him. Paul wasn't good with words, but he was clear and logical. Every word that came out of his mouth was cold. I was the one who slowly taught him how to handle people, how to deal with the old hands in the industry. Now he was skilled in these situations, but once he was out of that world, he still remained taciturn. In the past, I loved him no matter what, but now I realized, perhaps it was just that we had nothing to say to each other. I smiled as I spoke, cutting off everything he wanted to say. It's okay. I know Selena just returned to the country. She doesn't have a network yet, and you wanted to help her, so you took her to the banquet. Paul's expression changed slightly. It's okay, I said, looking at him, my voice gentle. I don't mind. Paul looked at me, silent. We stared at each other. I kept looking at him softly. After a long while, he finally averted his eyes, But suddenly, he hugged me, holding me so tightly that it was hard to breathe, as if he wanted to embed me into his body. His warm breath brushed against my ear. Elena, so close. You've lost weight. I smiled faintly, but didn't answer. The scent of sandalwood mixed with gardenia surrounded me, and I had to force down the urge to vomit. Chapter 15. The next morning, I got up as usual to see Paul off to work. I thought he was about to leave, but Paul suddenly stopped in the living room. Elena. He spoke gently. I forgot to tie my tie. I sighed softly, went upstairs to grab a tie, and handed it to him. Paul didn't take it. Instead, he lowered his head. Help me, Elena. I obediently tied it for him, and Paul kept his head down, standing quietly until I finished. All done. Suddenly, I was pulled close. My waist held tightly as we were pressed together. I looked up at him, but before I could say more, his lips were on mine, warm and insistent. Paul gripped my waist as he kissed me fiercely. It was intense, like a beast breaking free from its disguise, full of raw desire. When he pulled away, his eyes were slightly reddened. I looked at him, saying nothing. Paul planted another kiss on my forehead, his lips curving slightly. I'm off, Elena. I smiled and saw him off. Chapter 16. I arranged to meet Selena. The time was set for 10 in the morning. I arrived on time and waited for her in the cafe for another half hour before she finally showed up. Selena was beautiful, even before my father went bankrupt. She had lived a life of luxury. After my father's bankruptcy, her luck didn't run out. She married abroad, and now, after her divorce, she's back in the country with Paul helping her at every turn. So lucky. Selena sat across from me, her makeup flawless, her smile sweet. Meanwhile, I had dark circles under my eyes. I was thin, and I looked terrible. Ellie, why did you suddenly want to meet? We weren't that close, just former schoolmates, but somehow she spoke to me with such familiarity. I hadn't touched the fruit tea I ordered, the cold glass grounding me back to reality. You already ordered. Selena's gaze fell on the table, and she called the waiter with a smile. One iced Americano, please. She propped her chin on her hand, smiling at me. Your Song-dong also loves iced Americanos. I never liked them before, but I've grown fond of them recently. I sipped my fruit tea, not responding to her comment. Selena's smile was innocent and sweet. It was she who first told me about her divorce and returned to the country. Someone I hadn't seen in years suddenly added me on WeChat. Her tone was polite, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of smugness, as if she couldn't wait to tell me, I'm back to steal your husband. The fruit tea's fragrance faded, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. Her iced Americano hadn't arrived yet, and her gaze stayed fixed on me. When I looked up at her, her smile deepened. By the way, I have to thank your. A sudden, loud noise spread through the cafe. A few guests craned their necks to look our way. Selena's face turned to the side, a red mark blooming on her pale cheek. She seemed stunned by the sudden slap. She turned back to me, holding her cheek. Ele. I didn't want to hear her say my name, and one slap wasn't enough to vent my anger. I picked up the fruit tea and poured it over her head. The dark liquid dripped down her hair, onto the table, and spread across her white shirt. Lemon slices, peach pieces, and fruit pulp clung to her hair, clothes, and bag. Her makeup wasn't waterproof. Her eyeshadow smeared, making her look ridiculous. She paused for a moment, with countless eyes in the cafe watching our every move. Her eyes suddenly reddened, tears welling up, making her look pitiful. Elena, why are you? Chapter 17. Selena. I cut off her performance coldly. You know exactly why. Don't try your pretentious coquette act on me. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. You came back for Paul. You knew Paul would treat you well, and you wanted to take him away. Isn't that right? I looked at her calmly, my voice steady. Her face went pale for a moment, but she quickly composed herself, pulling a tissue from her bag to wipe the mess from her face. Yes. Selena looked at me, a determined smile slowly forming on her lips. Her voice low. Elena, you can't force love. The gloves were off. I looked at her and suddenly smiled. You're right, Selena. How about we make a bet? If you win, he's yours. I'll step aside, and you won't have to worry about being labeled the other woman. Selena looked at me, smiling sweetly. All right. Chapter 18. When Paul came home, I was in the room writing in my diary. Hearing him open the door, I put down my pen and tucked the diary into the drawer. Paul had been coming home early lately. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would join me for walks with Eve. One night, as I was reading in bed, he suddenly came over and pulled me into his arms. I leaned against him, feeling the warmth of another person's body. He rested his chin on my head, reading along with me from the melodramatic romance novel I was holding. The story reached a point where the male lead stood up for the second female lead, and the second female slapped the female lead, who cried out, "But I'm your wife!" His grip around my waist tightened slightly. I casually flipped to the next page. We kept reading, watching the male lead repeatedly help the second female lead while the female lead became increasingly heartbroken. In the end, she resolutely decided to leave him. The male lead had a sudden realization and immediately began to pursue his wife. After many twists and turns, they had a happy ending. We finished the book in the middle of the night. I remembered the sleeping pills in the other room and tried to slip out of Paul's arms, but he didn't let go, holding me tightly. "Paul Song?" I called his name. He responded softly. The room grew quiet, so quiet that I could hear his heartbeat. "Elena." He buried his head in my shoulder, his voice tinged with a rare hint of vulnerability. "You used to not call me by my full name." I suddenly felt like laughing. Paul didn't used to call me Elena either. He used to address me formally, with a distant and unfamiliar tone, politely calling me Miss Jean. It turns out we both had changed. I turned to face him, wrapping my arms around his waist, and called him with a smile, "Polly." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for any hint of emotion. Finally, he lowered his gaze and closed the distance between us. "Elena." I never knew Paul could be so affectionate, but if he truly loved me, then why was he so attentive to Selena? Chapter 19. It had been a week since I met with Selena. Our wedding anniversary was approaching, and Paul had been clinging to me more and more. I had written in my diary for 100 days, and today happened to be our wedding anniversary. A comment I had made offhandedly stayed with Paul. He came home early and spent the entire afternoon busy in the kitchen. I had taken Eve out to play, and when we returned, the house was already decorated. The food on the table smelled delicious, and Paul stood nearby, smiling softly, his gaze tender when he looked at me. "Elena, welcome home." Roses and music, cliché but romantic. Underneath the champagne glasses were 2 plane tickets, with a departure date 2 days away. I glanced at Paul, then at the tickets, and smiled. The clock on the wall pointed to 8. Everything was perfect, until Selena called. She cried like a delicate flower, saying she felt so miserable. She used the old, intimate nickname they had shared, "Polly." "I feel so terrible. I'm here all alone, unfamiliar with everything. Can you come help me, please?" "Polly." The romantic atmosphere came to an abrupt halt. Paul looked at me, just one look, and I understood. "Elena." "I'm sorry. I'll take her to the hospital and be back quickly." I only asked him one question. "Can you not go?" Paul looked at me, saying nothing. The atmosphere plunged to freezing point. I saw the smile disappear from his lips, and he reverted to being the Paul of 4 years ago. Cold. The Paul who was still a stranger to me. He averted his gaze but assured me, "I'll be right back. I won't miss our anniversary." We seemed to be at an impasse. Finally, I relented. I said, "Okay." Paul turned and walked toward the door, and I stood in the living room, watching his back. When he turned to look back at me, I smiled, just like countless times before, like a dutiful wife seeing off her husband. I said, "Be careful on the road." He said, "Okay." I watched him disappear into the night, the music still playing from the speakers. I casually smashed it to the floor, and after the loud crash, the living room fell into complete silence. I turned and went back to the bedroom. Paul wouldn't be coming back tonight. I knew that. Selena won the bet, but I didn't lose either. Chapter 20. I returned to my room. locked the door, and took out my diary from the drawer, flipping to the latest page, the last page. As I began to write, I suddenly found it difficult. Everything in my mind scattered once more, like an unsolvable mess of characters. My abdomen, head, and heart all felt as if they had been gouged out with a knife. Suddenly, I felt cold, a chill that seemed to seep out from my very bones. My hand trembled slightly as I held the pen, but I still wrote carefully, word by word. August 25th, 2022. Today is our wedding anniversary. Paul cooked for me and decorated the house. He also planned to take me to an island. Before the celebration could begin, Selena called. Paul went to find Selena. He left me behind. I will never get to that island. Goodbye, Paul. Tears fell, smudging the ink on the paper, but I didn't feel the slightest bit of sorrow. The tears that fell were brought on by pain. I lived by love, by the love of others and by my own love. Since no one loved me, I lived on the love I had for Paul. I once loved Paul so very much, but after all that sincere love was drained away, I was left with nothing but an empty shell. Like a candle burning down to its last bit of wick, it wouldn't last much longer. My last bit of love for Paul vanished completely today. When I finished writing the last word, I sat at the desk and burst into laughter, laughing freely. My part in this play ended today. Why did I hide the truth from Paul? Why did I keep pretending not to see their indiscretions? Why did I give Selena the opportunity? What I gave Selena wasn't a vine to climb, but a sharp, cutting knife. The living can never compete with the dead. It doesn't matter if Paul doesn't love me, but he will never forget me for the rest of his life. He will feel guilty for the rest of his life. I will make him feel remorse, make him regret. I will make him read this diary over and over again, forcing him to relive my emotions, making him forever remember how, as his wife slowly succumbed to a terminal illness, he relentlessly pushed her deeper into despair. This absurd drama reaches its climax with my death, and now it's Paul and Selena's turn. The hard sleeping pills stuck in my throat, making me uncomfortable. I forced them down with repeated swallowing until they were all in my stomach. On the table, there was not only my diary but also a meticulously crafted recipe book. His stomach is weak, and he's picky. Over the past 4 years, I painstakingly figured out what suited his taste. It's my final gift to him. I lay quietly on the bed, my hands folded, waiting for death to arrive. The room was very quiet, until a dog barked from outside the door. There was the sound of something heavy repeatedly hitting the door, producing a dull thud, but I just stared at the ceiling, indifferent to it all. Eve was still barking, but sleep was beginning to take over my mind, and my consciousness gradually faded. Chapter 21. Paul suddenly felt a tremendous sense of panic, as if he was about to lose the most important thing in his life. It was similar to that day in the banquet hall, when he saw Elena standing in the distance, pale and thin, looking as though she might vanish at any moment. One thought screamed in his mind, hold on to her. Don't let her go. But she still walked away. The overwhelming anxiety consumed him, and he even forgot the purpose of attending the banquet. After spending a distracted hour there, he hurried home. He expected Elena to be angry, to be jealous, to confront him furiously and demand why he had done this. But she didn't. She just sat on the sofa and smiled at him, then gently excused his behavior with a voice so tender it was almost comforting. The feelings of insecurity weren't soothed. Instead, they grew stronger. It's okay, Paul tried to reassure himself. Elena loved him very much. He had always known that Elena loved him because she had always been so straightforward, passionate, and sincere. He knew Elena would forgive him, would understand him. So when Selena called, crying and using that old familiar nickname, he agreed to go. Elena would understand. He took Selena to the hospital, got her hooked up to N4, and was about to leave when she suddenly grabbed his sleeve. Selena's eyes were still wet with tears. Her eyes read, Polly, can you stay with me for a while? Paul wanted to refuse. He had promised Elena that he wouldn't miss their wedding anniversary. But Selena looked at him with tear-filled eyes, her body thin and trembling slightly. It was late at night. He softened. Chapter 22. When Paul returned, it was already early the next morning. The lights in the living room were still on, casting a warm glow in the dim pre-dawn light. Paul quickened his pace, eager to see Elena. He had broken his promise, but there was no sign of Elena in the bedroom, nor in the study, or in the room where she used to sleep alone, nowhere. The food on the dining table was cold, untouched. In one corner of the living room lay the shattered remains of a speaker, clearly thrown forcefully to the ground. A few of her clothes were missing, along with Eve. Elena was angry. Paul thought she had just gone on a trip out of spite. It's okay. She'll calm down eventually. She'll come back in a few days. And he'll apologize. Explain everything to her. But days passed. And Elena didn't come back. No one knew where she had gone. Elena's phone was turned off. Her colleague said she had resigned 3 months ago. And her mother mentioned that she hadn't seen her in a month. Please tell her, when she has the time, to come pick up her bank card. I don't need her money. She can keep it. The middle-aged woman's tone was polite but distant. It was then that Paul started to realize something was wrong. The panic returned, even stronger than before. Like a wave crashing back after briefly retreating, Paul began to track Elena's whereabouts, looking into her social activities and checking the car's dashcam footage. Elena's days had seemed very simple. She went out for walks in the morning, bought groceries, came home for lunch, and then took Eve out in the afternoon, day after day. But sometimes, she would drive to the hospital. Paul wasn't stupid. Connecting the dots, the answer became painfully clear. He remembered waking up one night to find her staring out the window, wide awake. He remembered holding her increasingly frail body, the growing silence at the dining table, and the furrowed brow she often wore. Paul didn't want to believe it, because she hadn't told him anything, but he couldn't help but believe it. Because she hadn't told him anything, Paul searched for her for a long time, but it was as if Elena had disappeared. He couldn't find her anywhere. A month and a half later, a stranger's call reached him. They told him that Elena had passed away. Chapter 23. Elena died at a sanatorium on an island. By the time Paul arrived, her ashes had already been scattered into the sea. The person who greeted him was Elena's caregiver, a young woman who treated him with indifference. In the room where Elena had lived, she handed him 3 notebooks. These are Miss Jin's diaries and some other records. The woman paused before adding, Elena asked me to burn them, but I thought Mr. Song should see them. As she was leaving, she gave Paul one last look, her eyes cold and unforgiving. Paul sat in the room quietly for the entire afternoon. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, filling the room with warmth, but he felt a choking sense of suffocation, as if someone were gripping his throat. It wasn't until midnight that he finally opened Elena's diary. All the details he had deliberately ignored, the hidden tears and blood, all the pain she had swallowed alone, unraveled before him, weaving a sharp web that tore his heart to pieces. Chapter 24. May 17, 2022. The doctor said I've been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He looked at me with a touch of pity. Honestly, I didn't catch much of what he said. The gist was, it's incurable. The doctor suggested I start treatment and get hospitalized as soon as possible. I don't want to. I don't like hospitals, the cold walls, the pervasive smell of disinfectant, and the oppressive atmosphere. And there's no one to stay with me. I thought about calling Paul, but I didn't know how to start. What should I say? Should I tell him I'm dying? Maybe it's better not to say anything, but Paul called me. He said he had something to do tonight and would be home late. I suddenly remembered that Selena was supposed to come back today. Did Paul go to pick her up? May 18, 2022. I went to Paul's office to bring him lunch. I ran into Selena. She's just as beautiful as ever. The lunch I made for Paul this morning was eaten by her. I was furious. But then I figured, once I give something to Paul, it's his. He can do whatever he wants with it. May 21st, 2022. Went to see Mom. She's doing well. I thought about telling her, but then decided against it. Mom is happy now. I shouldn't disturb her. On my way back, I ran into Paul and Selena, and a little dog. I decided I wanted to keep it. As soon as the words left my mouth, I saw Paul's expression change, but I'm keeping it anyway. The vet asked me what its name was. Let's call it Eve. Eve, Elena. May 22nd, 2022. Last night, before bed, I asked Paul if his promises still counted. He said they did. I wish I were a bit more foolish. Then I wouldn't have noticed the way he avoided my gaze. Paul. Those who betray true love should swallow 1,000 needles. May 25th, 2022. I saw Paul and Selena's post on social media. It was a dinner with some young entrepreneurs. And in the bottom left corner, a small part of his face was visible. Her caption read, "It's great to have a big shot in the business world as a friend." I thought it was great too. So I gave her post a like. May 28th, 2022. Eve has been home for a few days now, and the pet supplies I ordered online have arrived. I went to the delivery station to check, and the owner had packed them all together. There were quite a few. When Paul came home, I asked him to help me pick up Eve's packages. He said okay, then turned and went to the study. I hope he remembers. June 1st, 2022. Children's Day. I took Eve out to play for the entire day. On the way back, I passed by the delivery station and decided to go in and pick up the packages. The station master was very kind and offered to help me load them into the car. Eve's room is on the second floor. I didn't wait for Paul to come home. June 7th, 2022. My sleep quality is terrible. I can't seem to fall asleep. During the day, I took Eve out and passed by a cake shop. I realized I hadn't had any dessert in a long time, so I bought a box of tiramisu. But when I brought it home, I suddenly lost my appetite. I used to really enjoy it, but now, looking at the sticky cream, I just felt nauseated. June 19th, 2022. Paul seems to be getting busier. He often tells me not to wait for him at night. As he fades out of my life, he appears more frequently in Selena's social media posts. Sometimes, I envy Selena. When she was young, our father loved her. When she grew up, her husband loved her. And after her divorce, my husband loved her too. But it seems like I have nothing. June 25th, 2022. I'm completely unable to sleep now. Awake all night. The pain gets worse. It hurts when I stand. It hurts when I sit. It hurts when I lie down. It hurts so much. The person in the mirror looks terrible. There's a faint yellow tint to my complexion. June 30th, 2022. Paul came home for dinner. I haven't had a proper meal in a long time. When I force myself to eat, it only ends up coming back up. So I just nibble a little. I excused myself to go feed Eve. Then, I coughed up blood. I've only ever seen this on TV, where the heroine has a terminal illness and coughs up blood. Looking delicate and tragic. I didn't get the heroine's treatment, but I did get her disease. It's not such a big deal, just a bit of blood. Compared to the pain and insomnia, coughing up blood almost seems insignificant. July 5th, 2022. Paul asked if I wanted to go to a banquet with him. I said no. I haven't looked in the mirror for a long time. I don't sleep well at night, and I can't eat. This morning, while brushing my teeth, I happened to glance up and see a stranger in the mirror. Hollow cheeks, slightly protruding cheekbones, dark circles under the eyes, and pale lips. I seem to have aged so much all at once, but I'm only in my 20s, in the prime of my life. It will only get worse toward the end. Weight loss, jaundice, abdominal pain, nerve damage. It will all cling to me like a shadow, tormenting me until I die. I don't want to die looking so ugly. July 11th, 2022. I broke my promise. I went to the banquet after all. Paul and Selena looked so well matched. If I weren't losing my mind, I wouldn't have had that thought the moment I saw them together. Later, Paul saw me. He wanted to come over, but I ran. I realized I was starting to lose control of my emotions. If Eve hadn't been there, I don't know what I would have done. July 18th, 2022. Abdominal pain, insomnia. I vomited again after eating. July 22nd, 2022. The scissors in the room were stained with blood. I only realized my arm was cut when I came to. I quickly bandaged it up. It wasn't the first time. I'm planning to go to the hospital tomorrow to get some sleeping pills. July 26th, 2022. abdominal pain, vomiting blood. The pain gets worse after eating. I don't want to eat anymore. July 30th, 2022. I nearly passed out from the pain while lying in bed. When I came to, I saw Eve by the bed, licking my hand. I patted her head. I picked up my phone and opened social media. The first thing I saw was that Selena had gone to the beach. The 9-grid photo was beautiful. In the last photo, I saw Paul's hand. He was still wearing our wedding ring. August 1st, 2022. Pain. August 5th, 2022. Went to the hospital and got painkillers. August 15th, 2022. I met with Selena. She's so beautiful. I haven't looked in the mirror for a long time. I know I've become very ugly now. August 20th, 2022. The sleeping pills seem to be losing their effectiveness. The doctor advised me to get hospitalized. He said it would get more painful as time goes on. I refused. I wasn't planning to live until the end anyway. August 25th, 2022. The original writing was crossed out in black lines. 2 new sentences were added. Elena died on this day, but Eve saved her. Chapter 25. August 25th, 2022. I was supposed to die today, but Eve wouldn't let me. She kept barking so loudly, making such a fuss. She barked so much that I couldn't sleep. She barked so much that it annoyed me. She barked so much that I couldn't take it anymore. With the last bit of consciousness I had, I dialed 120. A few hours later, I woke up, and 4 drip attached to my arm. A nurse stood by my bed. "Where's Eve?" She seemed momentarily confused. "Eve is." I braced myself against the bed rail, trying to sit up, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The nurse helped me up. "I want to go home. Your body is still very weak. You can't." "I want to go home." I lowered my gaze. Stubbornly and irrationally, I repeated myself. "Eve isn't here. I need to find Eve." Chapter 26. By the time I got home, it was already midnight. There were still messages from Paul on my phone. I didn't read them. I just blocked him. As soon as I opened the door, a little cream-colored dog jumped into my arms. Eve kept barking, rubbing against me, and licking me non-stop. I held her close, and suddenly, tears started to fall. All the emotions I had been suppressing burst out like a flood. I sat on the cold floor of the living room, holding her, and cried for a long time. I cried until my eyes were swollen. Finally, I buried my face in her fur and whispered in a voice that only the 2 of us could hear. "Eve, let's leave. I want to go somewhere where no one knows us. Just me and Eve, and love." I'm not sure if Eve understood my words. She just looked at me with those earnest eyes, and then slowly, carefully, wiped away all my tears with her little face. "There's no one in the world who loves me, but a dog will. A dog will always love the person who took it home. Eve will always love Elena." Chapter 27. I left that very night for an island and settled into a sanatorium. Life on the island was as beautiful as I had hoped. I spent my days playing on the beach with Eve and chatting with the townspeople. In the evenings, we'd go for walks by the sea. I love the ocean, the endless waves and the salty sea breeze. Just looking at the sea, my heart inexplicably calms down. I hired a caregiver, a young girl who was both beautiful and capable. After a few days of helping out, I told her that things might get tougher later on. When she saw me coughing up blood, she asked what illness I had. "Pancreatic cancer." I casually threw away the blood-stained tissue as I replied. Zhao Mian's eyes instantly welled up with tears. I panicked a little, unsure how to comfort her. The girl looked at me, and the tears started falling. "Sister Elena, you're only in your 20s. Her tears fell onto my hand, burning it with their heat. Why did you get this disease?" Girls can easily empathize with other girls, even though we hadn't known each other for long. Even though she didn't know much about my life, the sadness and sorrow she felt for me were so genuine. I wasn't actually sad. I had gotten used to it. But when she gently held my hand and, choking back tears, asked me, "Does it hurt a lot?" I cried anyway. The illness had long since tortured me beyond recognition. From the moment I opened my eyes, the pain woke up with me, and then it followed me everywhere. I couldn't eat. All those delicious foods I once loved now tasted like wax. I didn't dare eat, because it hurt more after I did. The suffering wasn't just physical. The insomnia led to nerve damage, and with no one to talk to, I had to chew on this pain day after day, all by myself. The only one with me was Eve. A dog can't speak. She would just circle around me anxiously when I was in pain, barking in distress. But when I held her, she would stop barking. She would just quietly lick my hand. It hurts, I told her. It felt like a complaint, almost like a plea. These were words I should have said to someone who loved me, but I couldn't find anyone to say them to. I couldn't tell my father, because his only daughter was Selena. I couldn't tell my mother, because my mother now belonged to someone else. I couldn't tell Paul, because he was planning a future with Selena. In the end, I said it to someone I didn't even know that well. Chapter 28. I stopped going to the hospital for treatment. It would only prolong my agony, stretching out the painful days. I survived on painkillers and sleeping pills. I grew thinner by the day. When I occasionally looked in the mirror, the person staring back had sallow skin and a gaunt face, nothing like a girl in her 20s. So ugly, I thought. Life is like a flower that withers all too quickly. I started losing the ability to walk. Emma would push me outside every day to soak up some sun, watching Eve play on the lawn. Sometimes, I asked her to take me down to the beach, to feel the sea breeze. Eve didn't mind that I was ugly. She still wanted to kiss me, but I wouldn't let her anymore. Emma stopped asking about my illness. She just chatted with me about everything, my past, her past, gossip, whatever. One day, while tidying up, she found my wedding ring hidden in a drawer and exclaimed, "Elena, you're married?" "Yes. And your husband?" She stopped mid-sentence, seeming to realize something. I just smiled. He doesn't know. He doesn't know I'm sick. And he doesn't know I secretly came here. "Are you divorced?" Emma blurted out, then quickly covered her mouth in embarrassment. "No." "Then why?" I smiled but didn't answer her question, changing the subject instead. Chapter 29. Life on the island passed quickly. All joyful times are brief. I was reaching my limit. The painkillers had stopped working. The pain had become unbearable. I couldn't eat anything. I hid a knife in my room. Sometimes, I'd hold the knife against my wrist. But then I'd see Eve sleeping peacefully, and I'd put it down. Living had become a burden to me. I hardly went out anymore, but lying down hurt too. So Emma would come and chat with me, telling me gossip from the town. She told me about how her neighbor's daughter and her boyfriend were going through a breakup, fighting every night. The girl eventually slashed her wrists, threatening suicide to stop the breakup. It was a scene of madness and hysteria. Emma shook her head. It was a terrifying sight. How could someone use their life to save a relationship? Because she once loved too deeply. That love turned into an obsession. That's when you become resentful, hysterical. I smiled at her. I used to be like that, because I've never been loved in this life. I've always craved it. Emma looked at me in shock. I never would have guessed. "Elena, you're so gentle, because now I have Eve." Try to help her, Emma. In the end, we all have to let go. She still has a chance to cut her losses and start over. But I don't. Chapter 30. I really can't hold on any longer. Chapter 31. I asked Emma to take me for a walk. The beach was nearly empty by the evening. We walked slowly, stopping often. The road was quiet. Eve didn't bark. When Emma pushed me back to my room, Eve followed us inside. I hadn't let her in the room for days. She ran to my bed, trying to jump up and snuggle with me. I asked Emma to take her out. She refused to let Emma carry her, dodging left and right, baring her teeth and growling, very fierce. "Eve." I called her name. She quieted down, looking at me with inexplicable sadness in her eyes. I looked at Emma. She picked Eve up and carried her out. Eve barked a few times outside the door. The sound faded away. I thought of the first time I met her. She was filthy, so thin, looking so pitiful. Later, the vet said she was full of ailments and had been abused. If only I'd met her sooner. The pain blurred my consciousness. I hope in my next life, I can bring Eve home sooner. Let her be a happy, healthy little dog, never starving, never freezing, never being mistreated. And I can learn to love myself sooner. Epilogue. Chapter 1. When Emma opened the door, a tall, thin figure was already standing outside the courtyard. It was Elena's husband. She didn't know when he had arrived, but there was a layer of frost on him. When he saw her, he gave a stiff smile, like a puppet on strings. Miss Zhao, could I trouble you to take me to see the places she used to frequent? Emma didn't reply. She didn't like this man. Elena had always been very secretive about her marriage, and Emma could only glean bits and pieces about her relationship through indirect questions. Of course, she was curious. One day, while helping Elena tidy up her room, she accidentally knocked a book off the table. A notebook fell out and opened. She admitted she was curious. As she bent down to pick it up, she glanced at the contents. It was Elena's diary. Paul's name filled most of the pages. In her early 20s, still full of imagination, Emma pieced together a story of a woman who had secretly loved someone for years but ended up marrying someone else. But when the man came to deal with Elena's belongings, she saw that he wore a wedding ring identical to Elena's. And when she saw the name Paul on his signature, she was stunned. If Elena had married the man she had loved for so long, then why had she come here to slowly wait for death alone? What had happened that made her never see the man she had once loved, even until her death? She couldn't understand, but instinctively, she disliked this man. She refused his request. But on the fifth morning of finding him standing outside her courtyard, Emma relented. Paul followed Emma to the places Elena used to frequent, a park where there were always many people, a corner cafe, a path around the island, and a beach. The park was where she took Eve to play with other dogs. She often sat in the cafe for entire afternoons. The path around the island was near the sanatorium before she needed a wheelchair. She could walk much farther. The beach was where she spent the most time. She and Eve were together there. When they got tired, they would sit quietly, watching the sea, as still as two statues. Paul walked these places over and over again, imagining her in them. 5 days later, he knocked on Emma's door again. A strange sense of fear washed over him as he hesitated. Miss Zhao, could you tell me about Elena? But the person in front of him suddenly changed her expression, her arm trembling as she held the doorknob. After a long silence, he heard her say, "No." The girl, who had always been cold toward him, now spoke with trembling emotion, her eyes red. What does Mr. Song want to hear? That she struggled alone with her illness, that she died alone, with only a dog by her side, or that when she died, she was in unbearable pain, tortured by cancer until she was unrecognizable? Elena never complained about the pain, but Emma could see the veins bulging on her forehead, the cold sweat on her brow. Emma didn't cry when Elena died. She didn't cry when Elena's ashes were scattered into the sea. She didn't cry when she sent Eve away, though she heard that Eve refused to eat or drink in her new home, curling up into a small, miserable ball. But being with someone, watching their life be destroyed by illness, watching them wither away, watching them in such pain yet still remaining gentle and peaceful, watching a living person turn into ashes held in your hands, how could she not feel heartbroken? It was supposed to be the prime of her life, but it was all irreversible. Emma's tears fell in large drops, uncontrollably, and she wiped them away with her hand. Her eyes were red, her voice cold. So, Mr. Song, when she was suffering, where were you? Where was he? Paul thought. He was with Selena. Chapter 2. Paul stayed on the island for half a month. He found the home where Eve now lived. He went there several times, trying to get Eve back from the person who had taken her in. The man who had taken Eve was rough-looking and unreasonable. No matter how much Paul offered, the man wouldn't budge, even threatening to chase him away with a broom several times. But Paul didn't give up. He kept coming back, showing up again the day after being chased away. After 7 or 8 days, the man reached his limit. Standing in the doorway, he shouted at Paul, and after venting his anger, he asked, "Why are you so obsessed with a mutt like her?" Paul stood there, silently taking the verbal lashing like a scolded schoolboy. When he heard the question, he hesitated for a moment, The air was silent for a while. The man was about to go back inside when he suddenly heard Paul say, "She was my late wife's keepsake." The rough man stopped, looked back at Paul for a few seconds, then turned and went inside without a word. Paul stood silently at the door. Moments later, the man returned, holding the little white dog. He handed Eve to Paul. "Take good care of her. Otherwise, if you meet her again someday, she'll blame you." Chapter 3. Eve wasn't very close to Paul. When Paul brought her back home, her bed and toys were all in the same place as before, in the old house. But Eve spent every day in the room where Elena used to live. Paul knew it was because that room still carried her scent. The little dog curled up into a ball, burying herself in the pillows. She didn't make any noise or cause trouble. She was very well behaved. Life seemed unchanged from before. Paul still went to work, came home, ate, and went about his daily routine, day after day. Except now, there was no Elena. He was an adult when he was hungry. He ate when he was thirsty. He drank when he was tired. He slept. One morning, Eve slipped out the door when he opened it. She ran off and disappeared. Paul was frantic, searching everywhere for her. When he returned home that night, he found her sitting at the doorstep. Her black, shiny eyes looked up at him, and then she lowered her head and let out 2 small barks. Paul picked her up, holding her close, just like Elena used to. The house was dark. In the silence, Paul held Eve for a long time before he finally sighed. She wouldn't blame me. She already wouldn't want to see him again. Chapter 4. People at the company said that Director Song had changed. But it wasn't that he had become colder, rather, he had become more gentle. Director Song used to be very sparing with words, always with a cold expression. Recently, though, he had been smiling more often, offering gentle praise for even the smallest things. The employees whispered among themselves, "If Director Song wasn't married, that smile would really take my breath away." What happened to Director Song? Did someone possess him? He's like a different person. Could it be? One of the girls laughed over her coffee. That Director Song was influenced by his wife? Director Song's wife was a beautiful woman, always smiling and gentle, but also very capable. Sometimes, when she visited, she would greet everyone warmly, never putting on airs. Speaking of which, it's been a while since Elena has visited. Paul passed by the break room just as he heard that sentence. It was like time suddenly froze. Paul stood at the door, unable to take another step. She wouldn't be coming back. Chapter 5. Eve continued to run out every day. In the afternoon, she waited at the doorstep for Paul, and when he returned, she would trot upstairs and go straight into Elena's room. Paul suddenly became curious. What did she do every day when she was out? He followed her one day, watching as she traced a familiar route to the park, found a sandbox, and dug in the dirt for a while before leaving, retracing her steps back to the neighborhood, circling around twice. Then she returned home, sitting at the doorstep, waiting for him. At first, Paul didn't understand, until one day, a girl in the park petted Eve and softly asked, "Eve, where's your sister?" Eve barked twice, then fell silent, and suddenly, Paul understood. This was the route Elena used to take Eve on every day. Even though Elena was gone, Eve still walked the same path. Chapter 6. That day, when Paul returned home, he followed Eve into Elena's room. The little dog crawled under the desk and pulled out an empty bottle. Paul picked up the bottle and looked at it. It was a bottle of sleeping pills. Suddenly, he remembered the line that had been crossed out in Elena's diary. "I can never go to the island again. Goodbye, Paul." Elena died that day, but Eve saved her. The empty bottle of sleeping pills, the scratches on the door, the tear-stained words, the unanswered messages, and the Elena who was supposed to die that day. All the grief that had been held back suddenly surged like a tidal wave, overwhelming him. Regret transformed into a monstrous force, devouring him and gnawing at him repeatedly. Paul collapsed onto the floor, replaying the details of that day over and over in his mind. It was like self-torture, recalling it again and again. What the hell had he done? Chapter 7. 3 days later, Victor finally managed to get his friend to open the door. Selena had sent messages and called Paul, but but he hadn't responded to any of them, leaving her no choice but to ask Victor for help. Victor had stood outside Paul's door, knocking for a full 3 hours. Paul answered the door wearing just a white shirt, stained with various splotches of alcohol. The sight startled Victor. The overwhelming smell of alcohol nearly made him gag. But Paul, though disheveled and reeking of booze, seemed emotionally stable, at least on the surface. He still wore that cold expression, and it looked like he could be reasoned with. Without a word, Victor walked into the house, following Paul. But when he saw the inside of the house, he almost swore out loud. Stable. His ass. The living room was filled with empty bottles of alcohol, neatly arranged on the floor. Nothing was out of place. Everything in the house was meticulously organized. Paul sat on the sofa, picking up a half-empty bottle of liquor from the coffee table, tipping it to his lips. He's lost his mind. Victor rushed forward and snatched the bottle away. The clear liquid spilled all over Paul. Paul glanced at Victor, saying nothing, but slowly reached for another bottle from a nearby box, preparing to unscrew it. Paul, what the hell is wrong with you? You're lucky you're not dead already. And you're still drinking? Victor grabbed the bottle from him. After just 2 sentences of scolding, he watched as Paul collapsed onto the sofa and closed his eyes. He's completely lost it. Chapter 8. When Paul woke up in the hospital, the first thing he saw was Victor by his side. His head was foggy, with hazy memories of Victor shouting at him. Paul thought for a moment, only recalling how he had kept drinking, and when he couldn't drink anymore, he went to the bathroom to vomit, only to start drinking again afterward. But he never got drunk. Victor put down his phone and saw his friend lying on the bed, staring at him with an unsettling, blank expression, even without any visible emotion. It was terrifying. Victor was furious. You damn. Elena's gone. The sudden statement interrupted Victor's anger. Paul's voice was hoarse, like sandpaper scraping. Gone? Where did she go? Victor's mind couldn't process it. Paul lowered his gaze. She was sick. What kind of illness? Pancreatic cancer. Victor fell silent. On our wedding anniversary, Selena called me, saying she was sick and asked me to come see her. When I was leaving, Elena asked me if I could stay. I didn't answer. That night, she was home alone and took a lot of sleeping pills. Victor. Paul looked up, his eyes dead, like a pool of stagnant water. Tell me, when she sent me off that last time, what was she thinking? Victor remained silent. When she took those sleeping pills and lay in bed, waiting to die, what was she thinking? No one answered. The man in the bed suddenly sat up, his eyes red, his voice thick with pain. It was unclear if he was asking Victor or himself. What do you think she was thinking? Victor abruptly stood up. Without a word, he walked out, slamming the door behind him. Paul was left alone in the room, left alone, staring blankly at the stark white walls. Finally, he broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Chapter 9. After being discharged from the hospital, Paul resigned from his job. Every day, he walked the same paths with Eve that they had once walked together. Day after day, year after year, he followed the recipes Elena had written for him, trying to cook, from clumsy attempts to becoming more skilled. But no matter how well he did, it always felt like something was missing compared to Elena's cooking. Eventually, he too began to suffer from insomnia. When he couldn't sleep, he would go through Elena's old diaries. Every page had his name on it. He read them over and over. Sometimes he cried. Sometimes he laughed. It turned out that she had quietly loved him for so many years. Later, Eve couldn't walk anymore. She had been a stray dog, with ailments all over her body, and her life was never meant to be long. If Elena hadn't taken her in, she would have died 2 winters ago. Eve stopped going out, curling up into a small ball every day, lying on Elena's pillow. Paul stopped going out too. He would eat, and then stay by her side. Chapter 10. On the day Eve passed away, Paul was right there with her. The little dog suddenly struggled to stand up, trembling, and barked twice at something in the distance. Then she gave a silly smile, her tail wagging weakly. Paul watched as she tried to move forward but then collapsed onto the bed, lying still. After a few seconds, She stopped moving altogether. Paul knew that Elena had come to take her home. Epilogue to the epilogue. As sleep swallowed his last bit of consciousness, Paul thought. So this was how Elena felt that day.